Fairy Sightings podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey-Hall and I'm a folklore researcher. Welcome everybody to the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce my guest this time, Amanda Mariamne Radcliffe, High Priestess and Bishop in the French Gnostic Church. Welcome, Amanda. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks. So I've been following your work for a while. We've had a few chats, haven't we? But I think the first time I heard you speak about your life and your experiences was listening to the Aeon Bite episode. It was one of the Cathars episodes. I know you've done a few. I think it was middle of 2021.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I really love all his interviews. But I was driving along and I got so intrigued by, what you were saying resonated with me so much that I felt it in my body. I ended up kind of taking a wrong turn on the way home this night listening to this conversation, because I was just so, blown away by what you were saying. And then I happened to see you again on Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour, which is a brilliant podcast for anybody that hasn't watched that before. Both great podcasts, Aeon Bite and Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour. And again, I think that time you spoke a little bit more about your experiences. And so I thought I really must get in touch. And it's been nice, speaking in the meantime, and sort of got to know each other a little bit more. So I'm delighted to finally, have you here. And I'm very interested in, first of all, perhaps you could describe to viewers and listeners about your life, because you've led such an interesting life so far, and what's led you to become a high priestess and a bishop.
Yeah, it's a long story. Like you, I've had a lot of experiences since I was a child, and my mum and dad both were psychic, and my dad would take me to spiritualist groups when I was quite young. And so I was always kind of immersed in that way of life, and growing up in a family with deep connections and roots in Wales and Ireland, like I think I said, and also the Sami in Scandinavia, we had these traditions already in the family to a certain extent. Like we were never allowed to wear the colour green when we were children, because our grandmother said it would signal that we belonged to the fairies and the fairies would come and take us. And we often were leaving food on the side of the plate, for example. My dad still does it to this day, and so do I. And we kind of were encouraged to pay attention to the fact that, there are invisible beings, and if you respect them, they'll respect you. But if not, they can be mean and play tricks on you, as you know. These old traditions were very much a part of the family, and I never really thought that much of it, because I started seeing things when I was 6, so it was quite early, and it was never overtly encouraged. Even though we had those traditions, it was just very much a part of our everyday life, but it was never discouraged either. And so I think it was just naturally there from the very beginning. And it is, there's when we look, it's about 6 generations that we know of, including our children now, who all had these abilities. And And none of my sisters can hide anything from their children because they know everything that's coming. You know, my nephew quite recently, they were going to take him to Disney World for a birthday surprise, and he knew all about it, even though they planned it outside the house because they made sure no one would hear anything. But he started talking about, I'm going to Disney World, and he was about 5. So it's been in the family, and it's been part of the kind of family environment. But even so, it was one of those things which, I don't know about you, how you felt like growing up with having these kind of experiences, but for me, I wanted very much for it not to be a part of my life. I wanted very much to have a normal life. And so I was always interested in finding out more about where these things came from, why they happen in certain families. You know, I wanted to know the kind of science and the logic behind it. So after a few years of almost wanting to pretend it wasn't real and never being able to, because, you know, when you're psychic, you just know things and you can't unknow them. I decided to study transpersonal consciousness studies. And that was the beginning, really, of a lot of how this got started, because around that time, I was having a lot of dreams. And these dreams led me directly to going to France in 2013, and they led me to contact a couple of people who were involved in these orders that I became involved with in France. But I met them through dreams. And it was because I was given the information about these people by dreams that they took me seriously when I contacted them. Yeah.
The flip side of what we're used to in terms of what's normal. They understand, okay, this person is actually one of us.
That's right.
That they are real.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these dreams were several years apart. So the first one was in 2009, and then the second one was in 2013. And the one in 2009 led me to a particular man and to his work. But I decided at that time that I didn't want to make contact with him because I wanted to resist, and I wanted to continue to believe that I could have a normal life doing an ordinary job and ordinary things. I think I spoke to you about this. Yeah. But then in 2013, as is often the case with these things, the other world asserted itself, and everything that was in my life at that time just dissipated. And I ended up going back home and moving in with my parents for a short time while I reassessed what to do next. And it was during that period that I had another dream, which led me to a woman called Iona Miller. And it wasn't even really a dream. It was more like a manifestation. It was more like a visitation, in all honesty. I'd been ill and the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. And so one night I was in bed and this light appeared in the bedroom. And when I think back to it now, I recognize that this was the beginning of the White Lady appearing, I think.
Yeah.
Because I think it's all connected. In this instance, this light appeared, and it was, I was awake, and well, actually I was sleeping, and then I awoke, and this light was there at the bottom of the bed, and it was huge and extremely bright and unearthly in its coloration and its intensity. And then I heard a voice, and the voice said, allow the radiant, healing, coherent light to enter your body and you shall be healed. And so I did. I mean, I was half asleep, but I was definitely awake, if you know what I mean. There was no way this was just a dream.
Conscious.
Yeah, I remember having the thought of, can I trust this? Is this okay? You know, but then it felt okay. And so I allowed it to come in. And then I fell asleep. And then in the morning I was fine. It was exactly as it said, whatever the it was. And then I went to Google and I looked up the phrase radiant, coherent, healing light, because I had never heard this before. And it took me directly to a video made by Iona Miller called Photonic Human. And I watched that video and it was pretty much exactly what I had seen in my vision or visitation, whatever it was. And she was, I say was because she passed away last year, unfortunately, but she was an artist, but she was also a consciousness researcher. She worked with a lot of the early consciousness people like Stanley Krippner and Hal Puthoff and people like that. She was part of the Stanford Research Institute, and I can't remember the other one's name. But anyway, she was deeply into quantum physics and how that interacts with consciousness. But she was also connected to the man who I discovered from the first dream.
Okay.
He said to me, have you ever discovered any, when I contacted her, I apologized and I said, I know this is going to sound crazy, but this is how I found you. And I explained. And she said, okay, have you ever found anyone else by means of a dream or a vision or a visitation like this? And I said, well, one person, and I named him, and she said, well, not only do I know him, but I made his website that you were reading. So this is two different people, several years apart. And that could not be ignored. And so Iona and I became very close, and she became one of my teachers. So she was a very big part of my life, but it was an indirect road through which I traveled, as is often the way with this, as we've discussed as well.
Yeah.
So the way I ended up becoming part of the Gnostic Church was I was doing psychic readings, which I still do, and a man from Paris contacted me and he wanted a reading. I gave him a reading, and what I saw in the reading, I mean, I still don't know what I think about past lives and things like that, but the things I have seen and witnessed in others and in myself, there's no other explanation for them unless we're somehow absorbing memories from other beings or spirits or something. But anyhow, what I saw with him, I described, and while I was describing it, he was crying, and he said that what I had seen was what a number of psychics had seen, little pieces of this story, but I saw the whole story and it unfolded in front of my eyes like watching a film.
Yeah.
And what I saw was that he had been part of a heretical sect in France that was meeting in caves, and that he was caught, he was tried, and when he was tried, before they hung him in the square, they castrated him.
Oh my goodness.
And the reason that he came to me, which I didn't know at the time, was because he kept having this urge to hang himself and castrate himself. And so I didn't know this. And that's why when I told him what I had seen, he began to cry. And at that time, I had no knowledge of the Gnostic world. I had no knowledge of the Cathars or any of these heretical groups. But what I did see is that they were worshipping an icon of a black Madonna, a black goddess, but a very kind of crudely painted one. And there were 13 women in the sect and 2 men. But the women were kind of like Vestal virgins in a way, but they were part of a Christian Gnostic group, except they were not exactly virgins, shall we say. They were doing all kinds of different rites that would have been at odds with what was happening in the greater culture at that time. And so I don't know exactly, but what I said to him was that I realized that we had to work together, and I couldn't charge him. We just had to do this work together, and I had to somehow help him and that he was going to help me in some way, but I didn't understand why I was doing this.
Mm.
So we worked together pretty much every day doing different path workings, with me in the UK and him in France, going to different sacred sites and doing work remotely with each other clairvoyantly. And that became very powerful. And it was through this work with him that he recommended me to some of his friends in Paris for readings and path working with me. And one of his friends came for a reading, and we then ended up working together, and he invited me out to Paris to join one of these groups. So this is how it all began. And as is often the way, once one door opens, you know this, another one opens, and then that is how it has been for the past 10 years now. It started approximately 10 years ago this year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because so looking back to 2013, that's really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about the Cathars and the Gnostic Church for people that don't know, they don't know about them and their story?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably begin with the Gnostic Church, really, because it was through the Gnostic Church in a way that I became cognizant more of the Cathars. But yeah, the Cathars, well, they were a heretical Christian Gnostic sect that came out of what is now known as Occitania in the south of France, the Languedoc region, in particular around the Ariège and the Aude. In the late, well, we could say it started as early, I would say, as 1089. The first known mention of them came around about this time, but they rose to prominence as the dominant, you could say, religious, how can I describe them, group in that region around the middle of the, let's say, 1150. And they started to get into a lot of trouble with the locals, because the local Catholics were not keen on the fact that, excuse me, I just need to have some water. It's really hot here.
We've got rain here. I don't know if you can hear the rain on the roof. Hopefully not. It sounds quite loud.
No. So the Cathars rose to prominence around that time. And the local, what happened basically in the Languedoc at that time, it was a place of great learning. It was a place of great, how can I describe it? When I spoke to Miguel, he had a really good way of putting it. It would have been the new Renaissance. It was the place of a spiritual Renaissance. It was a place when people could live side by side, practicing their faith, and there was no division. There was no judgment. A Sufi could be friends with a Jew, could be friends with a Kabbalist, could be friends with a practicing Catholic, could be friends with a Cathar. And it was a great melting pot of different cultures, because we had the Arabic influence, we had the Kabbalistic Jewish influence, and we had the Cathars. And the courts of love erupted in the same area at around the same time. And of course, that was influenced by the Sufi Arabic traditions that were coming in with the Moors. And so this whole region, it was very wealthy, it was very fertile, it had a lot of grapes, it had a lot of grain, it was a beautiful place, it had a great climate. And women were really revered in this place. They were really not only put on a pedestal, but given equal amounts of power in temporal terms. Yeah, and I think that was one of the most important things to come out of the area. So one of the reasons that the Cathars became so important was because of the prominence of women within their ranks. And the most remembered of the Cathar women are a woman called Dame Geralda de Laurac and a woman called Escalon de Foix.
Mm.
And Geralda de Laurac was really the chatelaine of a castle in Laurac. And at the time of the Albigensian Crusade, the reason that the Albigensian Crusade began was because the Catholic Church was very concerned that the local nobles in the region, who were very wealthy, who owned a lot of land, who owned castles, vineyards, oil presses, and everything else, were donating their land and their castles and their vineyards no longer to the Catholic Church, but to the Cathars.
Oh.
So they were welcoming the Cathars in. They were giving them land, they were giving them churches, they were giving them all kinds of things that beforehand they had pledged to the Catholic Church.
Right.
And the reason that they did this was because it was out of fear of the hereafter. It was out of fear of going to hell.
Yeah.
And so they would pledge so much of their wealth, like a tithe, but even giving huge amounts of land, because they felt that would guarantee their place in heaven. So the Cathars came along and they said, this is ridiculous. You do not need to do this. This goes completely against anything that's in the Bible. Read the Bible. Where does it say that you have to do this? And so the Cathars were very much of the opinion that the perfected human is not bound by material gain, is not bound by material desires, by greed, by excess, by excess of any kind. And so they were very simple people, and they dressed very simply, and they lived very simply. And some people have said that they could be compared to the Buddhists. They could be compared to like a Christian Buddhist, for example.
Right.
But I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Though I can see the correlations why people would think that. They were vegetarians, supposedly. And they had different rankings as well. So you could be a believer, in which case you were not expected to change your life in any way. You just practice the precepts and listen to people teaching, but you were not expected to become a vegetarian or become celibate. And then there's the credent. I'm trying to think about it in English rather than in French. Perfecti, the credent, and the croyant. Yeah. So there was the believer, the hearer, the listener, and the perfected. And so only when a person became what they call perfected were they then expected to become celibate and become a vegetarian and live a very renunciate life. But that was generally only permitted to a person who had already had children and had already been married, done their duty, had their children, and lived a full life, so that they could then pass that wisdom on to the people that came to them.
Yes. So they were ready to take that path. It wasn't something that they were losing. It was something they were gaining, in fact.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so it was not usually passed on to anyone who is particularly young at that time, unless they made that decision for themselves. And it was certainly not expected. And also, you were not just given that, you had to earn it through initiations.
Yeah.
So very similar to the Buddhist path, in fact, now, the different Buddhist paths. Yeah. And some of their initiations were quite harsh, like spending a lot of time underground in caves in the dark and things like that.
Sensory deprivation and
yeah, that's right.
And closeness to the divine, sort of divine. I mean, were they encouraged to go within, or were they encouraged to? Yeah.
No, they were absolutely, yeah. One of the most prevalent myths about the Cathars is that when they were murdered, so the Albigensian Crusade, I can't remember exactly when it began, but I know one of the first major battles that they had was in 1209 when they took Carcassonne, and they enlisted some very nasty dogs of war to come and completely destroy Carcassonne and take it. And they did that with Simon de Montfort, who was the leader of the crusade, who had been encouraged to cut the head off the dragon, is how they put it. They considered the Cathar heresy to be of extreme danger. And so these radical extremist Catholics, including some of whom were, real kind of experienced soldiers who'd been in other battles, they brought that to the Languedoc and they started the Albigensian Crusade. And so it began in 1209 in Carcassonne, really. And then I'm trying to remember whether Béziers was first, but there was a massacre at Béziers in which about 20,000 people were killed. And this is a very famous one. And that happened on Mary Magdalene's feast day. And at one point, they put the Cathars into a church that was dedicated to Mary Magdalene in the center of Béziers, and they burned them alive. And they said, as they were locking the doors, they said, "Now go and be with your whore mother," because some of the Cathars believed that they were actually descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And that's another reason why they were despised, because they believed that Mary Magdalene came on the boat, landed in France, gave birth to children, and then carried on that bloodline. So that was another heresy that the church could not tolerate. And the day when that happened, one of the soldiers asked the bishop, "Well, how do we know who's a Catholic and who's a Cathar?" And he said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." And so this was one of the greatest tragedies ever to happen in the history of Europe. It was an absolute travesty what was done to these people who were trying to just live a peaceful life and trying to live according to their own beliefs.
Yeah.
And so what happened after this is that before the fall of Mont Segur came the fall of Laurac, and Laurac was the castle owned by Dame Geralda, as I said. And unfortunately, what they did, because she was a woman, and like I said, women had power in those days. She was a woman, she was the lady of this castle, and she was managing this castle and the village associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure what happened to her husband. We think he maybe was dead or he was away doing something else, but she managed the castle with her brother Aymeric. And during the crusade, what they did was they took the dogs of war to her village, to her castle, and the castle was very securely defended, and she put up a very good fight, and she was actually fighting physically herself as well, which of course made them even more angry. And the only way that the castle fell was that it was betrayed from the inside. So somebody let them in, somebody let the soldiers in, and the soldiers came in and they unfortunately raped Geralda, and they did it publicly in front of all of her subjects, and then they threw her down a well and they stoned her until she died.
It's just horrendous.
Yeah, and then they hung 89 of her knights, and they raided the village and they took everything and killed whoever they didn't want to take. And the thing is, the reason this story is important is because it directly relates to what happened at Mont Segur, because I found out that the sons of these knights that were hung and some of the relatives of Geralda, they decided they were going to get revenge. And so I think it was at least 5 of them. They created an ambush for 9 Catholic priests, and they decided they were going to get revenge by slaughtering these priests. And so they had these priests and had them put up in a place belonging to one of their allies, and they went in and they slaughtered them as they slept because they wanted revenge. And unfortunately, that incident of killing those priests then led to yet another act of revenge by the Catholic Church, And that is when they went for all the rest of the places they could get. So they took Cuivre, they took many, Rock Fixard, they took many different places. And the last place that they finally took was Mont Segur. And they didn't manage to get that until 1244. So it was right at the end of the crusade, really. So you can imagine the years and years
Decades.
and years of, yeah,
Murder.
yeah. And one of the people that, so Cuivre, the castle of Cuivre was the castle where the courts of love originated, and were very much propagated there. And so it was a place where there was a great sense of liberal art, music, poetry, where people were experimenting with the ideas of the courts of love. So the idea of the chatelaine, the dame, the lady, the troubadours were there, and it was a very rich cultural place. And they took that castle and destroyed it, and rebuilt it in a really ugly style. And three of the people who lived in the castle, the father and the two children, became refugees and moved to Mont Segur. And they moved there. I think that castle was taken at around 1210, and they were noted as being among the 250 people who were burned at Mont Segur. So they would have been refugees at Mont Segur for 30 years, pretty much, by the time that happened to them.
Yeah.
So the displacement of these people and the way they had to go from place to place to place, trying to find safety. And all they wanted to do was practice their faith in peace.
Just to be left alone to live their lives the way that they, that they wanted to, the way that made most sense to them, and live their life according to their own values and beliefs.
That's right. And there are a lot of lies spread about the Cathars, which I've been trying to do my best to ameliorate, because one of the main things that they say is that they were against women, which is completely untrue, that they were against reproduction, which is completely untrue, that they thought that sex was evil because it was the way that the divine spark got trapped in the material realm, and therefore women were to blame, and all of these things, which again is what the Catholic Church has propagated. And it is not true. I mean, I've read all the Inquisition records, and obviously I've been living there for a long time. And spoken to a lot of the descendants of these people, and become very much a part of that hidden knowledge, that interior gnosis, which has been passed down through the blood, which has been passed down through the memories of these people who still survive. Mont Segur wasn't even inhabited for 200 years after the burnings. They were that terrorized by what happened to them. It only became the village that it is now much, much later on. And the reason that the Cathars, I think, became important again was because when the last Cathar, Balybast, was burned in 1321, before he was burned, he made a prophecy, and he said, after 700 years, the laurel will turn green again, good men and women shall return. And he said some other things about this prophecy too, which I can't go into here, but it was a very interesting prophecy. And so in the 1950s, in England, a man called Arthur Gurdon, who you may have heard me speak about before.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. He was a psychiatrist and a doctor from Bath. And he was educated at Oxford, and he was an atheist. But he was working in a psychiatric hospital, and he started to notice a group of women in the hospital who started to write things when they were in their apparent deluded state.
Oh, yes, I think
French. And
yes.
They started drawing what is known as the Cathar cross, or the Occitaine cross. And so he was very kind of taken by this. and started to ask them questions, and thereby he discovered that they seemed to be reflecting upon ancient memories which appeared to be their own and which appeared to be part of this Cathar faith. And so he, from being an atheist and a psychiatrist and a real person who was very skeptical, he started looking in the archives. He had to travel over to France because at that time no internet and none of this information was in British libraries. So he had to go to the archives in Toulouse and start digging to see if any of this information correlated, and to his shock, it actually did. And so when I became aware of Arthur Girdham's work, a lot of these pieces started to fall into place as well, because he was of the opinion that the majority of the psychiatric cases that he saw in his work, especially among women, were cases of undiagnosed psychic ability, and in a world where nobody believed them. And so his books are looking at especially the Cathars and reincarnation. And he's also written a book, trying to remember the name of it, the Greatest Heresy. I think it's called The Greatest Heresy, in which he just talks generally about the Cathars. So I think that this started to bubble up because it was the time of the prophecy drawing near, you see. So people started to remember, these women started to have these memories. And at the same time, earlier on around about 1890 in Paris, a man called Theodore Roche, he was working in a spiritualist circle in Paris with a lady called Lady Caithness, who was a theosophist. And they started to channel what seemed to be disembodied Cathars that said to them, and this is where it connects in with the story of the Gnostic Church, by the way, it said to them, this is the time for the era of Gnosis restored, receive the Paraclete. And so they were then told the names of these 13 Gnostic bishops, and Jules Dornel was an archivist in Orléans in Paris, near Paris. And so he was able to access the archives and find that these names were really of genuine Cathars that had existed.
Gosh.
And so he formed the French Gnostic Church, of which I'm a part, in 1890. And one of the main things that he was propagating was female ordination, because that is what the Cathars did. You didn't have to be a man to be a priest. That's another reason they were hated.
Yeah.
But if you go back throughout history and go back into the ancient texts, at the very beginning, it was women who really were creating the church around Christ while he was still alive. It was women who were paying his way, who were building his churches, in a sense, in their homes. And women in the very beginning were preaching. So this idea that women could never preach because Christ was a man, it wasn't there in the early church. And so the Cathars continued this on, which also indicates that their lineage, their heritage, where they began, is not a later thing, but that it could have come straight out of the Holy Land itself. Exactly. And that's what I personally believe from the research that I've done. I think they are like an undiluted stream which was coming out from that time.
And do you think that, so you mentioned Mont Segur, and just going back to that, you ended up living there, you've been living there for some time until fairly recently, haven't you?
That's right, yeah.
And do you think that it's possible that not everybody was murdered, and that there are still some bloodlines that would have been there from,
for sure, for sure. And that's definitely the belief of a lot of the people that I meet, and some of the esoteric groups that I have been welcomed into certainly do believe that. Yeah.
And do you think so? Just thinking about these kind of waves of periods in time when there's this inspiration, talking about the courts that the very sort of famous French romances and the times that those all blossomed, and then it reminds me of also the Romantic period and at the time of Enlightenment. Do you think that there are these times in our human history, our human experience, where the wave comes round again and kind of comes up to be born again, if you like, to carry us through into the next era, if you like.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, I do. And I think that's really
Mm.
beautifully said, the way that you express that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We call it the story that never ends, or the story that always returns.
Yes, this is it. And it seems to me at the same time, then you have these kind of forces of darkness that seem to be,
That's right.
yeah, it plays out like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was listening to a really, really interesting podcast interview over the last few days, and I'm not sure it's being released yet as we're talking, but it will be by the time this goes out, hopefully. And it's Spirit Box podcast. I don't know if you ever listened to that,
Yeah.
but it's he's speaking to Michael Leflemme, who's written a book about Atlantis, and again, tying in with people that are having these psychic abilities, whether it be through past life regression work, whether it be through, um, just as these women in the asylums were having just spur of the moment psychic awakenings and being able to journal information. I had obviously heard of Edgar Cayce, but I hadn't heard before of Frederick Oliver. And so the book talks about Frederick Oliver is this young man who, uh, would not have been expected to start writing about, well, I think it came to him in a dream.
Yeah.
Initially, he was told, you need to start writing this down. And the next day he began writing. And it was basically a kind of stream of consciousness from a memory of Atlantis and what he was talking about within that. I mean, this young, I think this was in it was something like 1836, I think. Um, and the kind of things that he was writing about were technologies that weren't even conceivable to human beings until the middle of the 20th century. And yet he's writing about these things that he would not have even known what he was writing about. And he said a lot of it, I don't even know what this is about, but he wrote it down, and he didn't publish it himself, but his mother, after he died, published it 25 years later. And that's why we have it now. So it's not even as if that he was writing something to say, look at this, it was, it came about not because of him. But the information that he came up with, and that Edgar Cayce and a number of other kind of mediums, clairvoyants came up with about Atlantis, is now kind of being proved in the archaeology, in history that's being revealed, and more knowledge that we're learning about, geological, as well as kind of archaeological and historical, and it's forming this picture. And what is so interesting and so striking is that what was coming through in this information was that we keep doing this. We've done it before. We are not only on a level within what we're going through now in our sort of last 2000 years, this cycle, if you like, but we've always done it. I mean, some of the information was going back, 50,000 years, and that there were these highly advanced societies, and that they reached a point where leaders got too either tied up in their own sense of power, or led by they were completely overcome with this desire keep pursuing the next realm of technology until, at one point in one evolution of their existence, they kind of disappeared into the ether. And just this idea that, as humans, we have continued to do this and then had to begin again. And so, here we are again. Here we are again. But I don't know about you, but when I was younger and starting to look into all of these ideas and learn about the world, not through what we're taught in school and not through what society feels is normal, but other ways of looking at the history of the world and humankind and our human existence and what that means. And the teacher that we had at the time, who I wonder is a bit like one of the people that that have been your mentors over time. This was a woman who was fairly elderly at the time, and had been one of a number of people who were situated around the world to bring knowledge to people. And she happened to come to Jersey every so often in her bid to do this. And she would talk about this time being, by the time I was older, by the time, this time we're in now, things would start to be happening, like the fall of the systems that we're used to and that were built up in, say, the 20th century for sure, and going back into history as well. But things like, education, things like health, and all of these systems, political systems, that they would all fall in our lifetime. And of course, in the 90s, we couldn't imagine this.
No.
But now we're seeing it. And what she did say was that this time, we need to ensure that this doesn't happen. We need to ensure that the cycle doesn't, erupt again. I don't know what you think about that and how that kind of ties into your own learnings and experiences and what you've gleaned from your mentors.
It seems like it is already happening, doesn't it, when we think about what's happening now with technology? Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because just yesterday, one of my friends who's very psychic said to me that he felt like at this time we have almost two different species of beings that are trying to work with us, but one is pushing us towards more and more and more technology, and they're giving us the technology, which is what, of course, all these latest disclosure conversations are indicating. And another one which is non-corporeal and which isn't physically solidified in this dimension, which is trying to draw us away from the technology and into our own more spiritual way of being. And he was saying that he believes that the two are kind of, not that, that they're kind of battling against each other for the future of humanity in a way. It's the first time I've thought about it like this, but given what you've just said, it does sound quite reasonable that this could be happening. And with all of the latest talk about, potential technology coming from who knows where that we have, and that some people are now attributing to aliens as of the last couple of weeks, we have to consider where this is going to end, with especially with people like Elon Musk wanting to download people's consciousness into computer chips and incorporate, what's it called again, this thing that he's trying to do with the brain. I can't remember what it's called now.
I haven't read about that. I'm aware of the entire flow in which it's going. Having read about that sort of in the 90s, actually, and seeing it all play out now is interesting and also fairly terrifying. But I guess it makes me think about, what happened to those other waves of human existence that did, say, for instance, if they did disappear into an ether, then you start to wonder, right? Who are these alien beings? Are there alien beings? Are they us coming back round again? And I know that, that's a line of thought that is that aliens can be us in the future. Aliens us from the past.
Exactly.
um, is it just feeding back into this loop all the time? And
Mhm.
is there really something about this time that means that we can break it? Have we really reached a point in our evolution of consciousness where we are ready to wake up and do something about it? Because, well, or is that something that each wave of human existence has felt that maybe this is the time that it stops? I don't know. And you can just but it's filling, it's kind of filling my thoughts at the moment, because it looks like an excellent piece of research that this man, Michael Laflamme, has undertaken, and his conversation with Darren Mason of Spirit Box Podcast. I highly recommend it, and I'll link after, so I'll send it to you. But yes, it's very poignant at this time, and
Mhm.
I think it's worth reflecting on. And is there some way for us to kind of move away from precipices if we can? But I have completely taken you off on a tangent
No,
there.
this is important. This is
It,
very,
it,
very important what you're
it
saying, because
is,
it all does tie in. It ties in very, very deeply with what we were speaking about, actually.
yeah,
These
yeah, it
waves.
does. And the
Yeah.
divine, because the divine, this divine spark within ourselves that, wakes us up, that, you had experiences as a child, I had experiences similarly,
Mhm.
and many, many, many other people have too. And it's this divine spark that can lead us, away from temptation, say,
Yeah.
um, and also towards our somewhere that we can be in balance again, if that's what you want to call it, to to meet with our divine selves as a global consciousness. And some of the experiences that you've had, um, which it'd be lovely if you could describe those in a moment. I just wonder if these are, if it ties into these topics that we've just been talking about, because they
Yeah.
not only awaken us but guide us in some way.
I think so. You are, of course, familiar with the lady and the encounter that I had with the lady. And for your listeners and viewers, this is a kind of being who is definitely not human. She's not a ghost, she's not a spirit, but she exists, and she has some kind of connection with this dimension and with humanity as a whole. And when I had my experience in 2016, it was very shocking because I had never encountered anything like this before. I'd seen many things, I'd had lots of experiences, but not anything so completely otherworldly that it had no other description to use. Plus, it came completely unbidden. It wasn't like I was going out looking for it. Well, most of these experiences come unbidden anyway, as we know. Um,
Absolutely.
I think sometimes when we look for them, they don't happen, as you no
Mm.
doubt know. But I think I was in the right state of receptivity at the time when it happened for me. I will describe that, but what I just want to say before I forget is that um, my first experience with the lady, and I've had 5 until now, happened in 2016, April 22nd, at a place called Orcival in France, which is in the Puy de Dôme region, which is the area which is the most famous for the Black Madonna statues that are
Oh,
throughout. Very,
yeah.
very ancient Black Madonna cult there in the mountains, and they're volcanic mountains too. So it's a very deep and intense and powerful place, anyhow. And it came about, I had not long been consecrated as a bishop in the French Gnostic Church, and I was making a pilgrimage to pray for 200 people at this sacred site with 10 other women who were dotted around different sites around the world. It was a private pilgrimage organized by a friend of mine called Raylene Abbott. And so we decided we were going to do this, and we all congregated at the same time, the same day, with time zones taken into account, of course. And my decision was to go to Puy de Dôme because I had, prior to all of this, an encounter with the Black Madonna. And so this encounter with the Black Madonna was a very important one too. And so when I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but when I met Richard Stanley later on, who'd also had an encounter with the White Lady, he said to me, first you get the Black Madonna, then you get the White Lady.
Wow.
And this is exactly my experience too. So my Black Madonna experience was in 2013 when I was working with this man in Paris that I told you about. That's another story for another time. But the White Lady experience happened April 22nd. I was in this church praying for 200 people, but the Black Madonna there had been painted white. And that was one of the reasons that I wanted to go there specifically, because I wanted to find out why they had done this.
Yeah.
And she used to be kept under the ground and only brought out a certain number of times a year for festivals. So she was very much a chthonic deity that was kept under the ground in the crypt. And people came to make pilgrimages to her from all over France in the 11th century. So she was very ancient and very powerful. Yeah. And she was known as Our Lady Breaker of Chains because she was considered to break people free from addictions, vices, or anybody who was wrongly imprisoned and things like that. So inside the church, there are many walls filled with balls and chains where convicts from ancient times actually walked there carrying their ball and chain and donated it, left it there as part of their penance, as part of their gratitude. And so the whole church is full of these ball and chains hanging on the walls. And so I felt this was a very interesting place, but that's all that I knew about it. And it just seemed like it was the right place to go to. And it was quite difficult to get to as well. So there was that whole ordeal of the pilgrimage as well to undertake. And so anyway, I went there with a friend, and when we got there, the church itself is made out of volcanic rock. So it has a certain intensity immediately when you go in. And it's a shrine church. And so it means it's open 24 hours a day. So people can come on pilgrimage and they will never find the door closed. So for that reason, the statue is behind a perspex case with laser beams all around it. So you can't get anywhere near it. It's like something out of James Bond. And so I was extremely angry when I saw this. I felt really like violated on behalf of the lady that this had happened. I'm really angry that the church had somehow captured her and put her in this box. All these strange emotions came up. And so I spent a lot of time in the church, and I prayed for these 200 people, and then went to my hotel room, which was directly opposite the basilica. And I went to sleep, and around 3 a.m. in the morning, I was woken up by an extremely bright light at the end of the bed. And that light then took the shape of a woman, and it was hovering 3 feet in the air. And she had no face, she had no facial features, but she was clearly wearing a veil or a cloak, because I could see the edges of the cloak. But she was made completely out of what appeared to be light, but the light had some kind of density to it, and it was coalescing. As I was looking, she was coalescing into the shape of this woman. And the intensity of the light was so strong that I could barely open my eyes. I could barely keep my eyes open. It was so strong. And then she had this this red light here where her heart would be, that was scintillating and moving. And she then spoke to me and she said, you called me, so what did you want? What do you want? And she said, people think they come here to see the Black Madonna, but this is what I really look like. You called me, so what do you want? And I couldn't speak. And I remember, even now, it's giving me goosebumps. I just remember this terror that came over me, but also awe and shock. And I don't even know how to describe it, but there was no way I could formulate a sentence, let alone a thought. And so this is where it gets really weird. So she scanned me. She extended this filament of light from the center of her body, and she just scanned up and down the center of my body for about, well, it must have been an hour at least, probably more. And at the time, I couldn't really move, but I wasn't paralyzed or anything. But I was in this sort of entranced state, but while being completely conscious. It was like some kind of communion was happening between the two of us. And I didn't want to break it, even if I could. And then at the end of this, she said, what you want is the truth, and the truth you shall have. And then this is where it gets even more strange. She said, if you want to know the truth about your boyfriend, look on his phone. And I suddenly like jumped up and said, no. And then she started to dissipate. And so she kind of, the window, she was in front of the window at this point. She'd moved from the end of the bed around to the window when she'd finished to scan me. And then she dissipated through the window backwards out towards the basilica, which is behind the window. And I was in complete shock. And the next day, my boyfriend came to meet me. He drove up to meet me. We had lunch. And of course, I had to have the awkward conversation to ask why such a thing would happen. And he confessed that he had been in touch with his ex-wife and things like that, you know, things that he'd said he was never going to do. So that was the awkward part of it. But that was the really strange thing about it, that she would be so interested in something like that, something so banal. But then this is where it gets even stranger. So my then boyfriend and I, before we left, we went to this little shop opposite the basilica, so right next door to my hotel. And we were speaking to the man who owned the shop, and he lived in the apartment upstairs. And he was quite a young man in his, I would say, mid-30s. And we asked him, do you know of anything that's ever happened, you know, in relation to this place? Anything strange? Have you heard any strange stories? Because he'd been working there for years and he lived there. And we never said anything about my experience. And he said, yes, me. And then he went on to say that a year before, almost to the day, his wife and 3 children had left, and he was suicidal, and he decided he was going to take his life. And he went into the basilica, even though he was an atheist. He went into the basilica and he prayed in front of the statue like I did. And he felt really angry in there, like I did, about the fact that the statue was behind this perspex case. And he then went home and he determined he was going to do it the next day. And in the middle of the night, 3 a.m., same time as me, he had this bright light wake him up. He sprang out of bed thinking something was happening outside, that maybe, you know, there was something happening at the basilica, but nothing. The light was still there at the end of the bed. So he sprang back into bed, completely terrified, and watched as it took the form of a woman. So the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she said to him, do not do what you are considering to do. And then she explained to him all the reasons why his wife had left, and that if he was to take his life, the consequences it was going to have on his family, his children. And he said that for him, his whole life changed in that moment, because he said he felt he was never going to feel that way again. And he said he recognized through that encounter that he'd closed down his heart because he was trying to be the man. And in so doing, he closed down his ability to connect with his wife at that time. And that's why she left. And they never got back together. It's not like it's a happy ending from a fairy tale, but he said he has never felt sad since that day again, because he believes that the lady is with him.
Gosh, so it's a healing. It's like his heart had healed. She healed his heart.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Gosh.
yeah.
Amazing. I mean, that is such a powerful experience that you had. Had you, I mean, I want to ask before I forget as well, did you ever speak to the church about the Perspex container?
No,
No.
I never did. No, but
No.
it was a curious thing. It was this feeling she'd been captured, that she'd been that she didn't
Mm.
belong there in a way, that she didn't belong behind that perspex, that she was being used in a strange way.
Yeah.
It was a strange thing. I don't really know. But he felt the same, which is odd as well, that we
It is.
both felt like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Had you ever had any experiences before that were similar, that was just completely out of the blue?
Well, I was speaking recently with a lady called Dr. Diana Pasulka, and she and I have become friends because she was very interested in the work that I was doing on Color Out of Space, the film that came out a few years ago. And she is a religious historian, and she studies comparative religion. And she has written a book quite recently called American Cosmic, which
Oh, yes,
is,
yes, 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 yes. Yeah,
yeah.
of
And
course.
she and I made contact because I was made aware of the existence of a man called Christopher Bledsoe, who is an American who has also seen the lady. And before he had his experiences with the lady, he was having many orb experiences,
Yeah.
some of which were quite terrifying, including very large orbs that were chasing him and his children on his property and things like that.
God,
He got
no.
investigated by MUFON and many different government agencies in America, and was considered to be telling the absolute truth.
Mm.
And he he became very depressed about the things that were happening to him, because he was in the Bible Belt, and he was considered by his neighbors to be mad, or even worse, like possessed by the devil or something.
Mm.
And the kind of scientific community were very kind of studying him in a quite invasive way. And the UFO community were kind of against him, because he was saying, well, these are not aliens. I don't know what they are, but they're not aliens.
Right.
And so he was in this kind of no man's land of, what on earth am I experiencing here? And the only way he can describe it now is that he had an encounter with another worldly being, like an angel, but not an angel as such, not an angel as we would know an angel to be.
Mm.
And the reason that I bring those two people up, is because Diana has recognized throughout history that we've got incidents, of these kind of manifestations throughout the Bible, throughout the Jewish macabre literature and things like that. And so she helped Chris to place his experiences in a more religious context, in a more spiritual context.
Mm.
And I made contact with both of them about my experiences with the lady, because I read Chris's transcript of his experience, and it was almost identical to mine. 3 a.m., hovering 3 feet above the ground, a woman coalesced of light, and bearing messages and asking questions, and very interested in us personally. And that's the strangest thing. Like, why would these beings be so concerned about certain people and their personal problems? In Chris's case, he had very bad colitis. He was extremely ill. I think it was colitis or Crohn's disease, one of those two.
Mm-hmm.
And he was healed by his encounter with the
Yeah.
lady.
Yeah. And I mean, BVM, what they call BVM, Blessed Virgin Mary
Yes,
encounters, um, which are fairly frequent actually, aren't they? I mean, they're not as rare as people might think, I suppose, but often healing does take place, doesn't it? Sometimes it's healing of a community even. Um,
exactly.
yeah.
And I personally think, I didn't know, because when this happened to me, I had no context for it. And I was traumatized, I can't lie, because what do you do with an experience like that? It's so, if it had just been me on my own, then I could have even written it off, like I have done with so many of my experiences. You've had them, but there's a little part of the mind that can think, oh, well, maybe I really did dream that, or maybe it really was my imagination. But when you have witnesses, when there are other people within 24 hours saying, yes, the same thing happened to me, and my then boyfriend was there as a witness, it's impossible to say this didn't happen. It's impossible to file that away as maybe this didn't really happen, which is how I've dealt with a lot of my experiences over the course of my life. I can't do that anymore. And it got even worse in a way, because after this, I had my encounter with Richard, and Richard and I met because I was working for a web TV channel in Paris at the time called Bagless TV, and my job was as a researcher, and part of my job was to find interview subjects for our channel. And my boss wanted people that spoke English, because he wanted to branch out to the US and UK market. So I had a list of 10 people that I needed to contact, and Richard was one of those names on the list. So I wrote him an email, just like I did with all the other 10, and he wrote back and he said, oh, let me add you to my private Facebook group, Terra Umbra, and then you can see a bit more about what I do. And so Richard was on that list because he lived in Mont Segur and he was an expert in the Cathars, and so that's what they wanted him to talk about. I didn't know that he had a history as a filmmaker, that years before he'd made several Hollywood films or documentaries. I didn't know any of that. I just knew, okay, he knows about the Cathars, we need to get him on the show. And so when I went onto Richard's Terra Umbra Facebook group, the first thing that I saw was him talking about his encounter with the White Lady and how that correlated to the Blessed Virgin apparitions. And that was when I had goosebumps, and my blood ran cold, thinking, oh my goodness, there is a precedent for this. This may well be a Blessed Virgin apparition. I mean, that is what the man in the shop thought it was, because he was a lapsed Catholic who'd become an atheist. But for me, because she had no facial features, and because she spoke in a very high-pitched, ethereal, otherworldly voice, and she didn't take that physical shape to me. She was just that shape of a woman in a cloak without a face. I didn't know who or what she could have been, and I didn't correlate in my mind at all with these apparitions, because I would probably think, well, why on earth would that happen to me, and so when I read Richard's post, I was in shock, and I contacted him immediately and said, okay, we need to talk, because this happened to me. And it's a little bit like the way I describe all of these events is, it's a little bit like when you've done active service in the military, how I imagine it is for people, that you've had these experiences that no one outside can possibly understand. And then you have to go back into ordinary life and try to adapt, like everything is normal, but you'll never be the same again. And that's how I felt after that experience. And so when I met Richard, I felt like, oh my goodness, I've got a comrade in this. I've got someone who really understands. And he explained about his experience 10 years earlier. And then he told me that in the Pyrenees, in Mont Segur, that there was a long tradition of these appearances, these apparitions that predate Mary, even. They go back even to Neolithic times, and which, have been a part of their culture. So that was how I ended up in Mont Segur, really, because I met Richard and we started being in a relationship. Yeah. And then I discovered, that it happened to him, and he had a witness as well. And then I started to meet more people who'd had these encounters. And the thing I just want to mention in relation to what you say about these times that we live in, and there is a man you've probably heard of, Ingo Swann, maybe. He's the CIA psychic who was part of the Stargate program. He's written a book called The Apparitions of Mary, and in that book he has correlated that these apparitions tend to happen in clusters just before we are about to enter into a very traumatic time for humanity. So when you think about what happened to me and to Richard and to others at that time period, it was just before COVID came.
I know. Yeah. This is
And
it.
so, sorry?
Yeah, this is it. This is it. That they do, it does happen like that. It can happen like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the apparitions at Fatima, she didn't give me any prophecies or anything like that, but she did tell me certain things. But with Chris Bledsoe, she has given him prophecies, not all of which he has been able to disclose yet.
Okay. Yeah. Makes me think also of the Mothman, how that played out as well, appearing to all of that community just before the collapse of the Silver Bridge too. And yeah, it does happen like that, that there's some kind of connection with the beyond, there's some kind of connection with the other world. Is it something? Well, we just don't know. We just don't know what it is, do we? Do you think that what do you think? Do you think it that these beings, like particularly these ladies, how would you describe what they are and where you think that they might come from?
That's a good question. I think they're interdimensional, definitely. They seem to coalesce using light. They seem to appear during the full moon very commonly. My experiences have mostly been around the time of the full moon, and so were Richard's too. They seem to utilize the energy of the place, so they seem to appear only in certain locations, generally speaking. Very, you could say, isolated locations. They seem to be correlated with water.
Yes.
And also with granite, particular types of stone, where there are high piezoelectric activities happening. Sometimes they seem to be correlated where there are tectonic plates moving as well. So where there are hot springs and things like that, volcanic places like where I was. So I believe that they are somehow connected to humanity and they're connected to each other. So the experiences that I've had, each manifestation has been slightly different. Though she's always never had a face. I've never seen her face. I saw her face almost once at a distance in Mont Segur, and it was so overwhelming that I thought, if I really see her face, I will not survive. I will not make it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that they can only manifest here for short periods of time, and that we can, however, make it possible for them to manifest here more securely by our own actions and by our own participation. The way I see it is that they're like, I believe that there is a realm which they come from, but where that realm is, whether it's in space or under the earth or in some kind of extra dimension which we just don't know of, which you mentioned the word the other world. That's how Richard describes it. So there are realms where in this earth we have those gates which can be opened through which she can come. And I think part of it is our willingness as well. I think she can only appear really to certain types of people, and it's not always the people that you would think. It's often those that are very humble or very broken or very ill or just very open, like I was, and I'd been praying for all of those people. She certainly doesn't seem to appear to film stars or sports stars or rock stars, like with the children. with the apparition at Lord, they seem to usually
Mm.
come to people that are children or humble in some way.
Innocent.
Innocent.
Mm.
Yeah, that's right. Um, and I feel they're often connected to certain locations, as I say. So I believe there's one in Glastonbury, as I think I may have said to you.
Mm.
I encountered one in Glastonbury at the White Spring.
Yes.
And
Can you tell us about that?
yeah, that was a complete surprise because when I went to Glastonbury for the first time, I had no expectations. In fact, my expectations were very very quite judgmental, because I thought it was going to be full of people on a fake spiritual trip somehow, um, and that was not what I experienced at all. And it wasn't some kind of Disneyland for people that were playing, if you see what I mean, which is what I'd
Mm-hmm.
been told it was going to be like. When I
Right.
went into
Okay.
the when I went into the White Spring for the first time, I did not want to go in. My friend Kate dragged me in there because I just didn't really feel like going in at that moment. But she said, "No, you've got to come in. Come on, let's go in now." It was quite busy inside there, and I don't know for your listeners, your viewers, the White Spring is an old stone chapel which has three interconnected circular bathing pools at the back, which are perpetually refilled with spring water that people can go into and bathe in at any time of the day when it's open. Um, and the spring is kept completely free of electricity. No money changes hands to go in or to participate in anything there. And it's taken over by custodians who take care of the place. And it's only ever lit by candlelight. So it's a very mystical place. And so I went into this chapel, this place, and I felt like I went back in time. Like I literally could have been anywhere, anytime. It felt so ancient. The frankincense, the candlelight, the water, the sounds of the water, and the naked people in the pools praying. There were quite a few of them, all naked, but completely full of reverence and love. And that's what I felt when I walked in there. And then I felt her. She was coming out of the left-hand wall where the Black Madonna statue is. And I just fell to my knees and I was crying. And my friend Kate was with me. And because she was holding my hand, she felt it too.
Mm-hmm.
And so she also fell to her knees crying. And to me, it was such a surprise because I just didn't think I would ever encounter her in this country. All of my encounters had been in Occitania and in Puy-de-Dôme in France. So to know that she was there and present and that she made her presence known, it was truly life-changing, because up until that point, I could never leave France. I had to stay there because she was there. And that was part of my life's work. And when I discovered she was in the White Spring, that was when I made the decision that I would come back to England for a while and spend some time in Glastonbury.
So an invitation to come back to to
Yeah,
Britain. Yeah.
yeah. And for anyone that wants to go, I would highly recommend that place. I think it's probably, for me, the most spiritually powerful place in Glastonbury, more so than the Tor or Chalice Well or the Abbey. But then that's because I'm very attuned to her and to her energy, whatever she is.
Mm. Yeah, I've been to Chadderswell and I've been up the tour a number of times too, but I haven't visited there yet, so I really must. I
Maybe
really
we can go
must.
together.
Yeah, yeah, we should. That would be lovely. And being down the
You
road in Bristol, of course, it's
enjoy it. Yeah, I do think you're
yeah,
going to enjoy the experience.
I think I would.
As for the way I see what she is, what I feel is that it's like they have a root system. That's the only way I can describe it. In the same way that trees have roots, and they pop up in different locations, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe somehow that these beings are all connected at the root. And whether that root is under our earth or it's, I don't know, maybe it's both, but certainly they seem to pop up, but they share the same root, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And their manifestations may differ, but ultimately they are from the same root.
Yes. They have the same kind of, they feel the same. They feel, would you say that they have different, not personalities, but a different sense to them, but ultimately from the same place? Or do you feel like they carry this exactly the same resonance as each other?
That is a really, really good question. I think they carry the same resonance, but they're overlaid with the flavor of wherever they manifest,
Yeah, yeah.
and also according to who they manifest to.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. Because I'm thinking about, often there's lots of white lady visitations and appearances in folklore, and they're often tied to wells, um, or water in some way, wells or streams, or even riverbanks. And it is interesting, isn't it? I don't know why, you know, why that would be. I mean, we just don't know the answers to these questions, and I don't know if it's even the same sorts of beings as what you have described. But
I think it might be. Mm.
mm, yeah, yeah, it is very interesting. I'd like to, speak to more people that have had these experiences too. And you also mentioned that you'd had some fairy experiences, and did they feel the same? How was that?
They were different, but just to finish with the white lady, I wanted to say that I think she also chooses how she takes form in a sense, according to who's watching. Because when Richard saw her, she looked very much more like someone out of a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy kind of
Okay.
story,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
kind of ferocious with a sword and things like that. Um, so I think that that's another thing that they can do. And regarding wells and springs, I was thinking about this yesterday. They are liminal places, and they are a place where there is a gap, and that gap is where the water comes through. So when we think about what that symbolizes, it's a place from under the earth where the water is pouring through from underneath the earth, and so it's a liminal place. It's a portal. It's a natural portal.
True.
Plus, I think they utilize the water vapor. I think they utilize that as part of their manifestation, because there was also a spring inside the church where I had my first encounter. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there was some kind of link with water there. So it was
Mm.
literally in the church. That's so
It was
interesting,
running
isn't it?
right through
So
the center.
again,
The spring was at the back, and it ran
yeah.
right through the center of the church up to the altar, and then it filled the font at the back.
Oh,
Well,
wow, how amazing. How
yeah.
amazing to have that. Imagine, being, if people were christened in there, what an
Mhm.
incredibly sacred place to be christened, if you are going to be christened.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Yeah, I was just thinking about Richard's experience with the sword, and if that was in Mont Segur, whether the kind of genius loci of that place of Mont Segur, given what took place there, maybe
Exactly.
that's why they had the sword, yeah, as a kind of a what, yeah, defending
Yeah,
location. Mm.
that's given me goosebumps. Yeah, I think that's true. And when the Cathars were killed, they they could have given in, and they could have converted to Catholicism, but they refused. They said they'd rather die than do that. But what's curious is just before they were killed, a number of the soldiers that were up there also converted to Catholicism, to Catharism. And it happened just before March. The March 16th was when they all died, but they all converted about a week beforehand. And Richard and I always wondered why this was, and we both believed that it was because she appeared there. And we've heard that they were aware, very aware of this being, this presence who had shown herself to them on the mountain. And Montsegur, the reason Montsegur didn't fall, and why it never would have fallen if it hadn't been fade also from within, which is how it did fall,
Yeah.
was because it has 7 springs at the top of that mountain.
So they just had what they needed there. There was
Yeah,
no need for them to come.
yeah.
Is it
Carcassonne.
document?
Sorry?
Sorry, I
Oh,
was
just
just going.
Carcassonne fell because it had no water. Fundamentally, that's how it fell in the end. Yeah,
Yeah, I have been to Carcassonne. It's an incredible place.
yeah.
There's a very strange vibe there, though, isn't there? It's a
Oh, yeah.
really, really odd vibe there, but it is an amazing place. Um, is it documented who or what, or in what way they were portrayed at betrayed, not portrayed, at Mont Segur? Do they know how might
Not
that happen? No,
exactly.
no.
No, only that somebody let them in, same as what happened in Lorek,
So you have that
unfortunately.
side of it. But then you also have the story of the soldiers converting, and that makes me think of, whether they saw this the lady or not.
Yeah,
When you know and feel the truth, there's no denying it, is there?
that's right. That's right. And what the Cathars developed was some kind of technology, and I say technology not in the technological sense, but some kind of methodology of being able to withstand walking into the flames. And that's how they were able to go in willingly. That is what has been said, has been passed down, that they went into the flames singing and they were not afraid. And that doesn't mean that what happened to them wasn't a terrible tragedy, but they had some kind of faith that was so incredibly powerful that it could even withstand the sacrifice of their lives. And they knew they were coming back. That's the other thing. The Cathars believed in the transmigration of souls. They believed fully in reincarnation, like the Buddhists. And so they didn't believe that that was the end. And that's what Baliabast said. And so the prophecy that he made that was coming back around in 2021, that was the 700 years that were up. And the interesting thing about the laurel is that the laurel was the symbol of the Cathars, but around the time, so in 2020, as well as having COVID
Mm.
come in Mont Segur, we also had the box tree moths, which ravaged most of the south of France. We had these moths come over from China, which ravaged the landscape. And Mont Segur was almost a husk of dead trees. But in 2021, the green started coming back exactly as Ballybass had predicted.
My goodness, that
And
is
this is the
quite.
time when more and more people are becoming drawn to the Cathars. When I do my talks, the amount of people that contact me and say, I have had memories, but I know
Yeah,
this story and this happened to me. And I remember this, I remember burning. I've got at least 2 friends that remember, including Richard, that remember trying to get children, babies and children down the back of the mountain, that there was a secret exit point, that they were trying to get children and artifacts down from the mountain before the place was taken.
goodness.
Um, so there are a number of people that have contacted me and said, they remember something.
Yeah, yeah. I must say, when I heard you talk about this with Miguel, yeah, it really, really, really spoke to me. And I also have heard, so I follow this astrologer on YouTube, Pam Gregory. I don't know if you're familiar with Pam Gregory's
I've
work.
heard of her. Yeah, I have heard of her.
Um, and she has had, in fact, I think she lived there at one point. She had a home there. Anyway, she's talked about it with friends of hers who also remember being there as well. So it was funny because after I heard you speak, and it's something that I have been interested in, being from Jersey, and I kind of had some connection with that area, but not Montsegur specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I have always been interested in the Cathars, but I had never really um, given myself the space to look at it properly until I heard you speak about it. And I think maybe it was just that this time, as in, because it was 2021 when I first sort of started looking into it, was the right time to look into it, and not before.
Wow.
Yeah. So you mentioned with the fairy experience, was that in Mont Segur as well, or was that somewhere else?
No, so my experiences with the White Lady, one happened in Orseval in Puy-de-Dôme, and the rest happened in Mont Segur. And then I've had one in England in Glastonbury, and another one in England in a Viking settlement, strangely enough. And in Richard and I were renting a place in Rennes Le Bain, which is where Henry Lincoln lived, which is not far from Mont Segur. It's very close to Rennes Le Chateau. And we created a stone circle in the garden. And I was sitting out. Richard was editing the film. He was editing Colour Out of Space in LA at the time. I was sitting out in the garden one afternoon with the cat, just sitting in the stone circle on one of the flat stones. And we had a river at the end of the garden as well. So obviously we have that river connection again, the water connection again. And it was very strange because this was in the middle of the day, but I suppose we should be used to this by now, shouldn't we? Really? Should be used to it by now, but still. To my left appeared three beings, which were about 4 feet tall, and they were clearly women. I don't know how I knew they were women because they were completely bald, and their ears kind of pointed up like this, and they had ridges on the side of their heads. And where their eyebrows were, they had ridges that kind of came up. And their faces were like, they had like human skin, but it was kind of shiny. And two eyes that were very normal eyes, like were quite big, tiny little nostrils, and a very sort of small mouth. And they were wearing these dark purple gowns that were going down to the floor, very kind of A-line, with a gigantic golden circle in the center, but like a ring, not painted in, just like the outline of a circle. And they just appeared there, and they were looking at me, and they were talking amongst themselves, and they were judging me. That was what was so funny about it. And they were kind of going, the voice was like that.
Yeah.
I did not know what to think, but I was quite scared, actually, I have to admit. And they seemed to be very old, they seemed to be old ladies of their species.
Okay. Yeah.
They seemed to be very old, and they were discussing me in front of my face. And they were clearly kind of trying to decide whether or not I was friend or foe, or whether or not, I was good or bad, I think. But I didn't do anything. I just sat and observed them, and then they kind of just looked at me sideways and scurried away into the undergrowth. And then within moments, another one appeared sitting on one of the standing stones, and this was a male of the same type, but he had extremely long legs, like long gangly legs, and he was wearing a red suit, like this color red, and it was all patchwork. It was like, I don't know why I saw all of these details, but it was all patchwork, this suit. And he had the suit and then the trousers to match, and extremely pointy black shoes, and he had one of his legs crossed over his knee, in that way of sitting. And he was just staring at me, and then he just turned around and was staring at the river. And I actually got quite disturbed at that point, and I decided to go inside. And then the same night, I was in bed and I saw something next to the side of the bed, which is about 3 feet tall.
This section is available for all members of the Curious Crew who support me on Patreon. Join us there for this and more bonus content. Patreon.com/The Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Amanda. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I feel like there's more threads that we can talk about because, you've had so many more life experiences with what you're continuing to do as well, and your travels, and talking perhaps another time about the film as well, because we didn't get to talk about the film, but it's a fantastic endeavor as well that you and Richard achieved. It was an amazing film, and as you say, so much interesting and important information in that film. So I'd like to talk to you again because you were talking about how that then sort of filtered into your life. So perhaps we'll talk about that another time. And yeah, just thanks so much for coming on. There's lots in my head now. I'm sure I'm going to be thinking of more things to ask you. And if people want to get in touch with you, which I'm sure they will want to do, because you mentioned that you offer kind of one-to-one consultations as well, don't you?
I
And
do. Yeah.
yeah, where can people find you?
I have a website which is just my name. It's www.amandamariamneradcliffe.com. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, but that's my website. It's just my name, so it's easy for people to find.
Brilliant, thank you. And what are you doing at the moment? Are you planning more trips to various places? Are you involved in projects?
Yeah, I'm working on a book, which I have been for a while, about my experiences over the last 10 years, and also about the film, about the experiences we had on the film. And some other creative projects, which I can't speak about just yet because they're still in the pipeline. And I'm still teaching, so I run a mystery school as well, which is another thing that people can do with me. And I feel like now the time is coming to start bringing people out into the land more. So that will be happening in Glastonbury and in Mont Segur and Rennes Le Bain as well.
Oh, fantastic. Please keep me posted about that. If you're going to do trips out there, then that sounds really exciting to me. So, and I'm sure lots of other people that are, watching and following your work as well. So thanks very much. And yes, we'll speak again. And I'm sure I'll see you in Glastonbury at some point soon too.
Yeah, I hope so.